And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Low pressure in the front moving into the southeast coast again. More of a rain than wind producer here, with rain from Queen Charlotte Islands all the way up into the eastern North Gulf Coast. Showers diminishing here over the eastern interior. Clearing increasing with light winds over the west side as high pressure shifts eastward ahead of this next big storm pushing into the Bering Sea. And tomorrow that will bring snow and blowing snow into St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Strait coast, maybe even farther east, especially tomorrow night into the central Seward Peninsula area for Tuesday night. Mostly sunny in the interior with a risk of a light snow shower for the eastern Brooks Range. Showers again develop in the afternoon here for the southeast interior from the Tanana Valley all the way down to the North Gulf Coast. Rain and wind, Pribilof Islands to a lesser extent over the Aleutians. And it stays wet over the southeast coast for Wednesday. Another system here develops and slides some rain up into the southern panhandle. Lighter precipitation, more showery conditions to the north. Mostly sunny here, central interior from coast to coast. And then this front weakening as it shoves some moisture and rain into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, Alaska Peninsula. Snow and rain, depending on how high the temperatures get up here, St. Lawrence Island, right on up into the Koyukuk Valley. And for the coastal water forecast, south coast of the Panhandle, south to southwest winds 10 to 15 knots, south to southeast at 15 for the central coast, north coast, east-southeast at 15. Lynn Canal, southeasterlies 10 knots, south at 15 for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, south at 10. And for Wednesday, Clarence Strait, south winds 15 knots, otherwise southeast winds at 10 knots for both Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal. West 15 on the south coast, light south to southwest winds at 10 knots for the central coast, variable at 10 up to the north. Prince William Sound, southeast wind 10 knots, seas 2 feet. Cook Inlet, variable to west winds at about 10 knots. West 20 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, light variable winds at 10 knots with seas 4 feet. Light variable wind conditions continue from the Barren Islands, all of the North Gulf Coast on Wednesday, even Prince William Sound. And southeast winds 15 knots for Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, south winds, especially in the afternoon, at 15 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. The Alaska Peninsula, west-northwest winds at 20 knots, or 15 to 20 knots here, with seas running anywhere from, 3 feet to 3 feet, and west winds 20 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, west-southwesterlies at 20 to 25 knots with 6 foot seas. And then 5 foot seas for Kodiak Island on Wednesday, or 5 to 6 foot seas with southwest winds at 20 knots, south 15 for Bristol Bay. And the Alaska Peninsula, south to mostly southwest winds at 20 to 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, small craft advisories, west-southwest winds 25 to 30 knots, gale warnings for the central Aleutians, south to southwest at 35 knots. And good gales out here from Kiska and Amchitka westward to Shumenatu, looking at southwest winds tomorrow, 40 knots, seas 17 to 21 feet. And for Wednesday, those winds drop off and stay west-southwest at about 20 to 25 knots. Adak and Atka, same thing, southwest 20 to 25 knots. And the eastern Aleutians, west-southwest, 20 knots, seas now 7 to 11 feet. And for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, southwest winds tomorrow at 30 knots. Yukon Delta Coast looking at south winds 25 knots and 30 knots out of the south for St. Lawrence Island. And Norton Sound, south at 25 knots. Gale warnings, St. Matthew Island, as well as St. Paul and St. George for south winds at 40 knots with 12 to 17 foot seas. For the Pribilofs on Wednesday, winds come down to 20 knots from the southwest, southwest 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. Southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound all have a forecast wind of 30 knots from the south. Up along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, we've got east-southeast winds at about 10 knots, central and west side south at 10, and much windier here for the Chukchi Sea, south to southeast winds 25 to 35 knots. And for the day on Wednesday, still very windy here for the Chukchi Sea with gale warnings, south to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots, southeast 25 for the western Arctic coast, south 25 for the central coast, and for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southeast winds 15 knots.